this episode, we are full on spoilers for both the novel and the film.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Max.
And I'm the Geeky Hippie. Welcome back to WoT the Adaptation, the YouTube show where we review adaptations from one form to another. This week, we continue with Rings of Power. But before we get into that, we have a special guest tonight. We have from the YouTube channel known as Philip Chase, this really awesome guy, Dr. Philip Chase. Philip, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, I would like to say thank you to you, Glenn, and to Rebecca and to Max for inviting me to take part in one of your conversations. This is very exciting for me. And I am just also happy to meet you guys on screen together for the first time. It's always fun on this platform to meet people who have the same passions. So and I have a YouTube channel called Philip Chase, where I basically am in this quest to find the best of fantasy. Is this sort of how I set it up? But I love fantasy. I am an English professor for my day job, a medievalist actually. But fantasy is a passion for sure. So I have been having a great time interacting with all sorts of folks here on this platform, and it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Awesome. I've added a bunch of YouTube channels just watching you talking with people. So it's been a great time watching your channel the last 2-3 years. Seems like
2.5.
Wow.
I think. Yeah.
Congratulations on that. Thank you for joining us. We very much appreciate you being here.
Seems like a good episode for you to be on too, I think.
Yes. Max, what can you tell us about this week's episode?
Well, this episode was titled Udun, I think. Udun. I'm not sure how they...
Udun.
Directed by Charlotte Brandstrom, I'm probably butchering that name. Written by Nicholas Adams, Justin Dobble, J.D. Payne, and Patrick McKay.
Oh, a lot of writers on this one.
Pretty much everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then best description is Adar and his army march on Osterith.
Yep.
Pretty accurate.
It was a very focused episode compared to other, we're really just focused on there's two sides of this one plot line, and that's it. So that was different than any of the episodes, I think, so far.
I had fun with it, but I can't call it a great episode. There were certain things that I found a little disappointing, and one of them is the writing. When you get 4 writers writing on a script, I didn't realize it was 4. I thought it was just 3. It gets a little sloppy, and this episode is probably one of the most predictable episodes of TV I've watched all year.
Wow.
I knew what beats were coming, and almost, from the beginning, it was just, that's out, yeah. And then it's like, reveals kept happening, like I just said that 5 minutes ago, so.
Okay.
But I still had fun with it.
I think it was interesting to see different responses to this episode in the fandom, because you have, I think, a lot of people saying that for them, it was their best episode of the show. But then I think opinions more like yours, Glenn, are also out there. So I think it's a little bit mixed, and which is not to say that your reaction is, you just didn't like it. It was just weaker for you, it sounds like, which is, I think it coming after episode 5. Episode 5 is my favorite so far. So compared to that, I didn't enjoy this one as much.
I actually liked it fairly well. Just in terms of pacing, action, I'd say dialogue was kind of light in this episode comparatively.
Yeah.
So it's hard to mess up if you have less dialogue.
That's one way to look at it.
We're just giving general assessment.
Yeah, your general reaction. We're not diving into any specifics yet.
Specific spoilers here.
No.
Yet,
but you can spoil. It's not like the whole thing is spoiler, so don't feel bad if you do put in something.
All right, so we can do spoilers. Okay.
Oh yeah, yes. Totally. This is just like getting us started, and then we'll go into specifics.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, for me, I think in a way Glenn is right about it being predictable. But I wanted that in a way, because I felt like what we had coming before this was a lot of setup. Yeah. And this is where things sort of just kind of started to fall into place. I feel like the last 3 episodes, it's 8 episodes, right, for the season?
Yeah.
8 total, yeah.
So I feel like this is where I was hoping it would go a little bit, where things would just sort of begin to click into place, and then things would be the velocity, the pace would increase with that. And I think that happened in this episode.
Undoubtedly.
It was probably the most action-packed episode of the season so far.
Sure.
I expect that to continue up until the finale. So, for example, spoiler here, but the idea of the tunnels and the great big trenches that the orcs were or the Adar was having the humans and orcs dig. A lot of people were puzzled by that earlier. Like, why did they go from digging tunnels to these open trenches? And what's the point of all this? I think that question was answered in this episode quite definitively.
Yes.
Right.
They had a plan.
So whether or not you buy the whole mechanism, we got the answer to, that's what they were up to. So I felt like a lot of things really kind of just fell into place here in this episode. And I also, like Glenn, I thought, okay, this is what's going to happen next. It's going to happen next. And yeah, it did, but it was satisfying to me. So I did enjoy the episode. Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of think all of these things are true about this episode. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's a variety of opinions we've given here, but I think all of them are true. Like, it's definitely the most action packed. It's definitely the start of like things, everything that's being set up coming into place. Also, predictable, so it's a mix. It's an interesting episode to talk about.
One problem it didn't have was pacing. I didn't have, it was a little bit relentless for a while there, but then nicely it did slow down, which unlike what some people believe you need to do between periods of, activity. So,
my only issue on pacing is just the timeline of events are just kind of a little wishy-washy.
Yeah. Because you have the two parts of it, the Numenorians and the Southlanders, and they're slightly out of sync with each other. And then
not even that. It's like the scene where they destroyed the tower.
Yeah.
And then it's like they had 2 days to prepare for a battle. It's like that felt a little not quite right. That the distance. It's like a Game of Thrones travel issue.
The two timeline problems I had deal with images that we see. Nothing in the story, just what we see on the screen. There's one shot where this cavalry is charging over a ridge towards the camera. And presumably they would be coming from the west, where the ocean is. Yet the sun is behind them. So is it sunset the night before they arrive in the village? Or is it that same morning and somehow the sun's behind them? Just the way it all cut together, it felt like it wasn't that long. It felt like it was the same morning that they were approaching, but the sun was in completely the wrong side of the planet, of the sky, to be that morning. It was in the west. We had a similar celestial body problem when they were sailing northeast, and the moon was directly across. It was centered on the screen. So, all right, if they're going northeast, then the moon would be in the northwest position. I don't think Middle Earth is that far south that the moon would be that far north looking. So the director picked a couple of celestial body shots that I had serious confusion based on.
Okay, I don't want to get too far afield here, but why would it matter about the moon?
It's just another example of me being confused by what they're showing on the screen. How would, it might not affect the timing, but the moon doesn't travel that far north unless you live below the equator.
Yeah.
The moon was in an impossible position.
Yeah, you're probably right, Glenn. I'll admit that I didn't even think about any of that. But when Max mentioned the whole idea of the plot lines not quite matching up, my mind went right where Rebecca's went, I think, which is for me, it was a bit of like the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where you have Lancelot off in the distance approaching the castle. And then he's approaching the castle, and then he's approaching, and suddenly he's there, right? And he's slaying the guards and everything. Right. It's just very abrupt. it was a little bit like that with the Numenorians showing up. Like they were at sea, and I thought, wow, how are they going to get there in time? They're so far away.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they were like on these horses going toward the village. And so, yeah, I mean, that I had to say to myself, okay, I'm just going to suspend my disbelief here and enjoy this moment. But
that was me exactly. But similar thoughts of like, okay, you know, you're just sort of playing with the timing of things to serve the story. It's just not like it's not quite lining up, you know, or the tension of it isn't quite right. But yeah, anyway. All right, so let's start getting into our more specific questions. And we always are starting with, and this tends to be sometimes a lighter question for this particular adaptation, since the source material is what it is and not always providing us a direct thing to adapt. But if there are changes from the source material, you know, what did you notice? And, you know, did it affect your enjoyment of it, either positively or negatively? Do you want to start, Dr. Chase?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I tend to have fewer problems with changes from the source material, perhaps, and I'm a very devoted fan of Tolkien's work, but I also feel like an adaptation is an adaptation, and it's a different story in some ways, and I just start out accepting that. So. Yep. Things that I liked, for example, I'll be specific to this episode.
Right. Yes.
There are characters that are created specifically for this show, like Halbrand and Adar, as far as I know. And I like what is being set up through these characters and their relationship, particularly to Galadriel, which is, we have a very different Galadriel here from the one maybe most people are used to seeing if they only know the Peter Jackson films. So this is a younger, more brash, less wise Galadriel in many ways, and that's what they're going for, clearly. And I enjoy the relationship that is developing between her and Halbrand. Did they have a kind of a little moment there?
There was something.
Did you pick up that vibe too? There was a little bit of
that end conversation.
Yeah, I mean that's one of those quieter moments too, where I thought. One thing they did well, and I think it was Max that mentioned it earlier, there's a lot of action here, but also they did succeed in getting us some quieter moments, like post-battle conversation there between Galadriel and Halbrand. And I really liked too the thing going on between Galadriel and Adar. And this is definitely a departure from Tolkien, where we have. I'm listening to Adar and I'm like, yeah, he's got a point there. The orcs deserve a place too, right? They're creatures. So that's definitely a departure from Tolkien, where there's zero sympathy for orcs. I think it's fair to say. So I'm cool with that though. I think it's actually it brings out something interesting to me in Galadriel and in the world. Like, okay, this is a facet to Middle Earth I hadn't thought about a lot, and I like that. You know, that's an interesting presentation there for me.
I love what you said, because I think that you're kind of zeroing in on like probably a couple of the most important changes that if you want to, like, I mean, it's not really that important a lot of times to talk about nitpicky things, but you're talking about characters that have been created completely and how well they're working as character foils, and that's huge. And I thought the same thing about this episode, that one of the things it did really well, and it's probably the biggest departure from Tolkien of the entire season, is getting us to look at things from an orc point of view, or an Uruk point of view.
Yes, Uruk.
And that is something that Tolkien did not do at all. It is really antithetical in a way. Like,
well, if you want to get into it, Tolkien estate's been very against any kind of point of view from the evil side.
Yeah, I mean, and evil is fairly, it's a black and white kind of evil for the most part in Tolkien, and here we're asked to think about things with a little bit more shades of gray, and I do like it.
I seem to remember recently seeing in an article like a snippet of a letter, one of Tolkien's many letters that's been published, and I don't remember the exact wording, but there was something in the snippet where he was saying the orcs shouldn't be seen as nearly as evil, or not as fully evil, wholly evil.
Okay.
That they weren't just about evil.
You know, he was always
I
revising
can't remember how it was said. Yeah.
His own, thoughts on things to some extent. So, maybe that is something that he kind of, evolved to. I mean, I think if you just look at like what's in the text of the Lord of the Rings, it's pretty black and white. Like, there's nothing in there that makes me think that orcs need to be sympathized with at all. But maybe that idea, was in his mind at some point, in which case, that's fair game too. But I like it either way.
They've taken maybe a seed of an idea, and it's not something that Tolkien did much with, but it came from Tolkien, which is the idea that Adar, and Galadriel talk about, which is that orcs were elves,
right?
And they were twisted by Morgoth as an act of just pure, evil and revenge and all of that, and to create an army. So that being the case, Tolkien doesn't really get into a sympathetic view of the orcs, but there's that seed there, and I think that they're doing something with it, which is kind of cool, to say, okay, well, if orcs are actually elves in origin who were tortured, then why are they not deserving of some kind of understanding and sympathy? So
and if you think about how they began the show too, going back to episode 1, nothing is evil in the beginning, and so they are asking us to think about that, like where where they came from. What do you think, Max? It doesn't have to be on this. I mean, you can add your own thoughts too. Other things that are changes or anything you want to bring up.
On that front, nothing really to add. For changes, I don't really, from the earlier side of the books, I don't really care about the changes much. But there are changes to timeline that this has definitely put in here. When at the end of this episode, where we now feel like this is definitely Mordor.
Yes.
We know from like the way the books go, I believe, is when this event happened, that was a call to arms to raise an army against Gondor, which doesn't exist.
No.
Because Numenorian's homeland is still there, and Isildur hasn't founded Gondor yet.
Right.
They're kind of adding in some things, which I don't know. It gives us kind of a cool moment, I guess, of like Isildur and Elendil like being there on the scene is not something that should have happened, but I don't know.
Still holding out that these are ancestors.
No, you gotta let it go. I think you gotta let it go, Glenn. I don't think that's gonna happen. I think it's
who knows? It might happen. No, there weren't any changes. I can't think of any changes from the material or additions, I should say, to the material that really bothered me or caused any conflict with, like Peter Jackson's in this particular episode, at least. All the changes, all the additions, this stuff I liked, including, my favorite scene of the episode. We'll talk about that later. That was something that obviously wasn't even hinted at in the Legendarium. So, but I do like the word Moriandor. I tried Googling that, and there is no example of that. So somebody put that one together using Sindarin. So at least I'm assuming Sindarin.
Okay. All right. So we like to talk about how the show adapted from a visual standpoint. So anything to do with scenery, costume, props, but you can also consider, it doesn't have to be just visual, but any kind of CGI effects, creatures, music. How are they creating the world, essentially?
I actually thought it looked pretty good most of the time.
Okay.
There was a couple of shots of the water rushing through the ravines and all that, the canals that were made, where it just seemed a little off, to the point where I'm like, is that a miniature at a high-speed camera, or is that CG? And I could tell it just didn't look real, a couple of those shots. But other than that, I mean, no problems. Visually, I really like that shot of the water falling into Odru, and it reminded me of the shot at the beginning of Two Towers, with Gandalf and the Balrog falling through the hole down into the lake. That was I saw that immediately beneath Moria, beneath Khazad-dûm, right there.
Glenn, spoilers.
Yeah, I know, it's a couple thousand years from now.
Okay. Yeah, that was a cool shot. I did wonder, I bet a big amount of their budget went in this episode, because there was I mean, just creating the ending. The ending was huge. I mean, I did think it looked great. Say what you want about it, but I think it did look very good. I just hope it wasn't half their budget. Yeah, because then they need to find a new studio that's a little cheaper, because
I know.
Hopefully not. They had. I mean, a lot of other stuff has looked great too. So I mean, they're spreading it around, I think. But
not as much was put into costuming budget as I would have thought before watching this episode, because it was even more evident this episode that quilted white gambeson they have underneath their, I guess it'd be a cuirass still, of scale armor. Yeah, was just quilted clothing. It gives the illusion that they're wearing scale armor over more of their body than they actually do, because of the way the quilting is done. And so it just lessened the expense that armor looks like it had, at least production wise.
I think it's kind of, I mean, I don't mind that. I think it's actually ends up being kind of a cool effect. Like, they're not trying to pass it off as something it isn't. It's just, it's
giving an illusion.
It's a visual, effect that it would have, so.
I'd still say that I barely even noticed the music in this one.
Oh, really? Wow.
I'm back to not noticing the music as much in this episode either. I think where the music is strongest for me has always been in Numenor and somewhat in Khazad-dûm too. Like, there's certain themes in the soundtrack or the score that stand out really well for me, and others fade a little bit more. In general, like any kind of action music throughout the whole thing has either been like just a little bit more generic action music, not necessarily standing out in a particular way to me. So I think that could be why for me in this episode. Similar, it didn't impact much, but
there was one theme that really stood out to me, and it's when Bronwyn and Theo are talking and saying goodbye before the battle.
Oh, okay.
And he has her repeat that thing. She's, that this shadow will pass.
Yeah.
And the music playing over it.
That was good.
It was so pure. It sounded straight out of Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings compositions, but it still had this undeniably Bear McCreary attitude towards it. It was just, but he's heavily influenced by Howard Shore's music anyway. So
I think
that for me was one of the most purely Tolkienian moments in this series, was when she was telling him that about there's a light beyond the shadow. Those were good lines. I like that. I like the way she delivered them. I thought that was a really powerful scene. And visually, I feel like this show that's probably its strongest aspect, is the visuals in general. I feel like it's for me anyway, all along I've been pretty impressed. In this particular episode, I thought that some of the fight sequences were actually really good. I enjoyed Arondir was my man here in this episode.
He was awesome.
It was really awesome. So I thought, wow, okay, this was as far as that went, really well done. And some of the wounds and stuff. I don't know. I'm not a medical person, but I was definitely wincing when they were taking, the arrow out of Bronwyn and all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, they did not hold back on that. I agree. That was a visceral moment. They really did not. I mean, they were showing you like a much more, intense reality of an arrow wound than we usually get in these kinds of things.
When I saw the arrow wound scene, I'm not necessarily medical, but I do have kind of medical mind in the sense that it felt like that was way too much blood.
I did wonder about that.
I mean, it wasn't arterial, so it wasn't spraying, but it was gushing so much. I don't know if firing it would really save you.
Yeah. I did
Because
wonder
I
about
think
that. It
cauterizing
did seem like
would.
a lot of blood. Yeah.
Well, you just pool inside yourself, especially if you hit the like one of your arteries on your part.
Yeah.
So like
Yeah.
it wouldn't do much good. You'd still die.
I bet you that medical professionals could
I need one of those doctor YouTube react people to tell
Yeah.
me what's wrong with that scene.
yeah. I think
See-
they probably could. I mean, I don't know. Personally, they could have dialed it back a tiny bit, but but I think in general it was good to make it more visceral. A lot of times people are seeming to like shrug off arrow wounds, which is a little bit too far in the opposite direction. So
Yeah.
Right.
and I
Well-
don't want to get too focused on like, personally I don't like to get too focused on, oh, this medical doctor could be like, oh, that's nonsense. Like, okay.
What's next,
Okay.
Becca?
Well, let's see, because I feel like, oh yeah, okay, so we kind of covered that. Great. Oh, dialogue. All right, so let's talk about just dialogue in this episode in general. I feel like, Max, you kind of already touched on, like, you felt like there wasn't as much dialogue to focus on in this episode. Dr. Chase, you mentioned a really great sequence that Bronwyn had, and that's where they're pulling directly from Tolkien, to use that line. So, giving a line that was written by Tolkien to a different character in a completely different context.
Yeah.
But you know what? I like that. Like, so to me, that was a great moment because, as you said, it made it feel Tolkien to have that. And I like it when they can use that because they don't have a ton, in terms of like dialogue or text by Tolkien that's going to work very well directly for this adaptation. So I like it when they can repurpose something like that. And there were some pretty intense lines, I thought, also, particularly in the scene with Adar and Galadriel.
Yeah.
That was, I think, a great sequence of dialogue because there's just such intensity to what both of them are saying, and so that whole scene, I think, was great dialogue.
There's one line
I will
that
say that one part I love about
good.
Adar
Mhm.
is you can never tell if he is lying or telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, that's true.
you have to be good at writing to get that amount of is he lying or not.
Yeah, it's dialogue and actor, because
Yep.
I'm very impressed with him in this role. I think he's doing a great job.
There's a line of dialogue that didn't completely click for me until I
Okay.
watched it a second time, to watch the episode a second time. And it's used twice in the episode. And it's the opening when Adar's planting those seeds in the ground and buries them and says, "New life in defiance of death."
Yeah.
I think I'm paraphrasing. I might be
No,
paraphrasing a little
are
bit
you
there.
talking about, because I think
And then
there-
Arondir,
Arondir says-
Arondir, you mean,
yeah.
right?
Arondir and Bronwyn are talking, and he gives her those seeds, and
Mhm.
she, without prompting, says, "New life in death, in defiance of death." And I'm just like, she happened to fall on the exact same line that Adar was using, almost like a ritualistic prayer.
I didn't catch
And I
that,
just-
actually.
Yeah, she
I
used the
haven't
exact
rewatched
same
it.
words. I've watched it 3 times now.
I like that line, though. That's good
It is.
dialogue.
That's
Yeah.
I think that
It
might be
had
my
that feel
favorite
of a
line.
ritual, didn't it, Glenn? I mean, it almost felt
Yeah.
like a ritualistic sort of thing. Maybe somehow would have both known, I suppose. Maybe that's
Which is why
Yeah.
maybe she's just instinctively knew,
Yeah.
Maybe
like
it's
happens in
the-
fantasy.
I wonder if it is an elven thing. If it is a ritual, I wonder, I mean, Adar would have that from, he was an elf, and I don't know if Arondir might have shared that with Bronwyn, but I don't know. It does
Yeah.
have a ritualistic feel. I like it.
Hmm.
Arondir even kind of described it as almost as a ritual. So
Yeah, absolutely, it is. Yeah, that it's to plant seeds before a battle. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I also like the scene between Adar and Galadriel when she was interrogating him.
Yeah.
And he's doing a great job with the acting. I forget the actor's name, but he's the one who was in Game of Thrones playing.
Joseph
Molly?
Morrow.
Yeah,
Is
playing
it Maul or
Benjen
Molly?
Stark, right?
But,
Yeah.
Yep. I think he's a New Zealander.
Is he? Okay, cool. Yeah. Anyway, whatever he is, he's doing a fantastic job with that character.
Yeah.
And the fact that he, even in a situation where he's clearly, not got the upper hand.
No,
he's still managing to kind of needle and manipulate Galadriel in that interview. I love how he keeps kind of just like saying Uruk, and he wants her to, he's using it as, yes, I insist that you give me this respect, but he's also doing it deliberately to get her angry, and it works. He's just a very manipulative, kind of sympathetic now, I think more than before even, villain here, which is being done quite well, I think.
Really, yeah. One more thing I wanted to mention, because this is a line that Galadriel has used a couple times, where she says to Halbrand, excuse me, one cannot satisfy thirst by drinking seawater. So that's kind of, she in particular seems to have lines that she uses sort of habitually, so something that has meaning to her, and it's become a little bit of like maybe a shorthand between the two of them, that line.
I kind of thought he had said it to her.
He might have. She said it back to him in this episode.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought happened, because
it's been said mirrors. Before. I can't remember if he said it to her, she said it to him. I think it might be, you're right. But either way, that line has been used in scenes between the two of them multiple times. She said it to him in this episode. So there's,
because the fact that she's now saying it.
Yeah.
The fact she's now saying it to him, if I'm right, and he had said it to her, mirrors what happens in this episode of her stopping him from killing Adar, and then her pulling him back.
Yeah.
So it mirrors that dialogue bit. So
I think this is kind of getting more into characters and away from the dialogue specifically, but like Halbrand and Galadriel as foils for each other, it couldn't be more clear than it was in this episode, because they each appeared to need the other one to rein them in and help them remember what they are trying to do. So that was a cool mirroring.
And I just hope they don't try shoehorning in some romance between the two of them. I want the two of them to be fast friends, like Legolas Gimli type friends is what I want from these two. I have never really gotten the sense that they're gonna like lean heavily on that like, to me, this relationship between the two of them is super important, whatever it is, whatever character or nature it's going to end up having. The foil relationship that they have between the two of them is really important, I think. So I don't know that there would ever be a romantic shade to it or not, but I think it's gonna go way beyond that, in my opinion. But that scene, though, we talked about earlier, that scene at the end, where fighting in battle beside you, I felt this, and she's like, yeah, I know the same thing, I felt it too. And I'm like, I hope they're not going. That's why it's even on my mind. I never would have thought that until seeing this episode. And I was like,
so the actors are a little cagey when they're asked about it. And they did talk about this episode in particular, and the decision to stage their big scene with each other the way that they did, where they're not looking at each other, because they had agreed that whatever they're feeling in that scene is too intense for them to look at each other, and then that would just sort of like cause whatever it is to overflow. So that doesn't have to be romantic, but it is meant to be very intense, whatever it is. Okay. So
I would guess that they won't go there, simply because of where I think Halbrand's character is going to end up.
What do you think about that? Because I think this episode has brought up lots of conflicting things for people on that.
Yeah. Well, I've been fairly convinced that his is not going to be a good future.
I mean, I don't think too many people think he does have a good future. Yes.
I like him. So, I mean, he's kind of a lovable rogue, but he has shown tendencies that make me think that he could end up, for example, and this is a very common theory, but as one of the Nazgul, for example, or as the king of the Oathbreakers, perhaps, one or the like two, seem the most likely outcome for him. And my sense is that he and Galadriel are there could be little hinty moments of something, but really they're going to remain friends, I guess, who keep learning from each other in the courses. And there'll be something tragic to that too, because I think this will be a terrible loss for Galadriel if Halbrand indeed goes the way most of us are thinking.
Yeah, I think you're right. Something I was going to add to that, but go ahead, Max. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, how about the theory that he's Sauron?
Yeah, I was going to go there too. And the issue I have with
if we believe Adar saying he killed Sauron,
that
would give us the credit saying why you hate him.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, so
if he
a lot of people seem more convinced that some people seem more convinced he's Sauron after this episode. Some people seem convinced that he is not Sauron after this episode. So clearly, I've seen like a very opposite reactions, which I find interesting. The issue I have with him as Sauron, if they were to go that direction, I can see some interesting things about that. But the issue I have is you'd have to be writing Sauron as essentially very repentant and conflicted, because although we've seen Halbrand be manipulative in some scenes, we've also had scenes of him utterly alone where he's clearly conflicted. Like there, he's not, it's not a situation where you can write a I've been evil all the time, mask off kind of moment, because we've seen him where he's not manipulating anybody and he is truly conflicted. And that
we've seen him where he
a take.
We've seen him where he's
would be tough
we've seen him where he's pretty sure nobody else is watching him.
Absolutely.
And still he's sitting there, deep contemplation with a regretful, remorseful, pained look on his face. Yeah. Sauron wouldn't be doing that unless he knew he had people watching him.
It's
agree to disagree on that.
You think they could do like a fully like?
Well, it's the same. It's the same idea of making the stranger Sauron, of making him the 180 of pulling it. Oh, he's actually Sauron. Like he's being led to be like this good guy because he helped the hobbits. So it's the exact same kind of thing. Why would he do this off screen of helping them?
Yeah,
I think it's much more likely, if we're looking for Sauron, that you're going to have a more of an Anatar type situation where he's somewhere among the elves because of what, and this is previous episode, but okay, we're going there.
Go for it. No, bring it in.
Because of the way there are hints that Celebrimbor has ideas that aren't coming from necessarily himself about the mithril, and that's been passed on from him to Gil-galad. It just seems, and I talked about this with AP during our discussion of episode 5, and AP
good conversation,
a very coherent theory about this, that Anatar has been active in poisoning Celebrimbor's mind, and that he's passed that information along to Gil-galad about the mithril. And this is very much a deception and a setup. So if that theory is true, then Halbrand
makes no sense. And I agree with that more than anything, that because something has to be going on there. There's some behind the scenes machinations going on there. And obviously Halbrand can't be doing that. So if he's Sauron, who's doing that?
Right.
I didn't post the comment I was going to on that wonderful video of the two of you talking about last week's episode. But I have one fact that can undercut a little bit AP's theory.
Okay.
Celebrimbor was able to study and knew about the mithril and its properties because Elrond had given him the piece that Durin gave him. At the beginning of that scene when Celebrimbor is telling him, "Sorry, I lied to you." If you watch it again, he's passing back that mithril piece back to Elrond. So Elrond, because Elrond did betray Durin's, the oath he gave to Durin, he talked to Celebrimbor about the mithril. He didn't talk to the king, but he swore to not tell anybody. And then we have him talking about it with Celebrimbor after getting the piece back. So he did break his oath, and so Celebrimbor does have another means of knowing about. So it doesn't completely undercut AP's theory.
I don't think it does. Yeah, I mean,
it takes out one of the points that he used.
Going back when he said that Halbrand can't be it because these undercurrent machinations going on in the background. If Halbrand can't be it, then neither can the stranger.
I don't think the stranger is.
I
I
don't
don't
think
think-
either.
Can we
I
just?
agree.
I'm on the record.
Yeah.
The stranger is Gandalf.
I pretty much.
Yeah,
am-
I'm convinced of that.
Yeah.
I don't think they're going to try to pull a fast one on us and have it be, you thought it was Gandalf all along, but it's Radagast. No,
No,
I mean,
I can't articulate this fully because it's not my theory, but I was chatting a little bit with David Green, and he had a whole different theory about do you guys know his stuff at all, his channel, Easing the Reader, and then he has David Green Writes, I think is the other channel that he has, but he has a very different theory. He doesn't think it's Gandalf, but I can't articulate it very well because it's not my theory. So
gotcha. We'll put the link in the doobly-doo.
yeah. So okay, so next we're on to our most memorable scene or sequence, either for ones that you enjoyed or didn't for some reason.
We talked about mine a little bit earlier. My favorite scene, and it's that scene between Galadriel and Adar in the barn.
Yeah.
I just the interrogation and that whole conversation, and yeah, half of it was exposition, but you know, I'm a science fiction fantasy nerd. I love exposition. That's kind of what we get, you know. So I didn't
read
mind that.
exposition-y to me because it felt like there was something like there was so much conflict happening in that at the same time.
There
It
was,
didn't feel that
but
way to me. Yeah.
we got a bit of a backstory history on the origin of the orcs, as we talked about earlier. You know, and
it's
his
the way to do
obvious
exposition because
Yeah.
it doesn't feel like, hey, I'm just handing you this information.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it.
Yeah, exactly.
It has weight to
But
it in that scene. Yeah.
Yeah, and that scene is just emotionally strong, you know. And I think it was Max earlier said, I never thought I'd take the side of, you know, understand, or it might have been Phil, understand the side of an orc, you know. It's like, and to be honest, it was reading Lord of the Rings for like my 10th, 12th time when I was like 13 or 14. I started getting this idea for a character that was an orc who didn't want to kill. You know, and how would that work? You know, an orc growing up in that society, you know. So, you know, sympathy for the orcs. That's why I tweeted the other night when I live tweeted, you know, Uruk Liberation Front, everybody. You know, because, you know, it sounds like Adar was pushing.
Points. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I agree. That was definitely one of the best. Anyone else want to share one?
Could I just say all the action sequences?
Okay.
Like pretty
did
much
that.
the tower scene for sure.
Yeah.
The scene with the water rushing down the volcano.
Yeah.
You have the scene with Galadriel and the horse, and chopping the orc in 3 pieces, which I just loved.
Yeah, and that just really upset some people.
It
who are
did.
who don't seem to remember that Legolas did things equally insane.
More
that's
He
what
was
I
only
do.
1,200 years
More
old.
Yeah.
He was only 1,200 years old when he did that.
Right, he
And then
had
of
much
course
less time
the
to practice. Yeah.
and of course the fight scene between I can't remember the name. I'm just gonna call it like Dritz and the orc and the arrow scene going towards his eyeball.
Oh, Arondir and
Arondir.
and yeah, no, that was intense. Yeah.
And the hulking Uruk. That was
Yeah,
a
I
big
gotta
orc.
agree with both everybody. Actually, I mean, Max, you're so right. The action sequences were great in this. I totally agree about the interrogation scene with Galadriel and Adar, but also another standout scene for me, and we already mentioned it, but it does really, it was effective, was the Bronwyn Theo scene, where she was reciting the Tolkien lines, and that's the first time I felt actually connected to Theo. And not that he's been doing terrible acting or anything like that. He's been fine for me, but I just felt more frustrated with him than anything up to this point.
Yes.
And there was a moment there for me to feel like, oh, okay, I kind of like this kid, and he's showing, of course he's scared and he's vulnerable, but he loves his mother, and there's a beautiful thing going on between the two of them there. So that was a good moment for me too.
Yeah.
My first connection to Theo was last week when him and Arondir were shooting arrows. That scene with Arondir is...
That was good.
And Arondir continued it this episode. You know, I'm really loving that character. I think he might be my favorite all-time elf in anything that has elves, because Arondir is just awesome, and he's willing to take Theo. I mean, when he's talking to Bronwyn this week, about the two of us going off together and Theo, you know,
Yeah.
and he's already making an overture to play kind of a father role for Theo last
He
week and this
absolutely
week.
is. Yeah.
And I'm just like, I love that kind of thing, you know?
Yeah. This was a great episode for Arndir as well. Like, you know, he had some real standout moments. And yeah, so you guys have mentioned all great things. I'll only just mention a couple other things to add on to it. But one thing I thought that was very effective was right before the attack, there's a long sequence of silence, and then, or you know, near silence, and then you just see like the little pinpricks of light that start growing. I thought that was very effective. And then the other thing, which we already have mentioned, but I'll just say again, is definitely a standout scene, was the scene between Halbrand and Galadriel, where like they can't look at each other. But there's some intense stuff in there as well.
Speaking of that scene where they're watching the lights come up over the hill, that was another one of those beats that for me was entirely predictable. From the moment I saw that hill and Arondir looking out the door, I knew exactly how it would play out. The little light would pop up, be there by itself for a second, then another light, and then all of a sudden a whole bunch.
Absolutely.
I'm not saying it was bad. It just, with so many successive beats throughout this episode, that I'm like, this is how that's going to happen. And 2 minutes later, that's how it happens. I'm just like,
yeah.
I normally don't mind it.
I think that that's fair. Like, it was predictable. I predicted it as well, but I still liked the way it created a mood. I still thought it was effective. So
well, it's
I
like,
don't know.
It's like
That
the key sword. I predicted that fake out pretty easily.
Oh, did you see that?
Oh yeah, I did too.
I didn't see that. I didn't see that coming.
That one bugged me. I think
as soon as he said, "Hey, Waldreg, I got a thing for you," I knew. Right, Max. That's when you knew.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. See, I didn't, and so I was like slightly annoyed when like he pulled out the axe, because I'm like, what? Like,
why didn't they check earlier?
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that moment, you know, with Waldreg until my second viewing of the episode, and I'm like, aha, because now that's where it happened.
I caught that right away.
It makes sense, and I guess if you catch it, then it probably, in a way, maybe it works better, because then you kind of know something like that is happening. It felt like a sort of bait and switch to me when it happened, because I hadn't noticed the Waldreg moment, or I hadn't connected it to that, and so I was like, "What is this? Like, why are?" And now it's anyway. So that does make me. It does make me wonder if that sword needs human blood, and that's why he sent Waldreg to do it instead of one of the orcs, because he could have just sent any of the orcs to go bleed and then turn that. Yeah, but he sent Waldreg.
Interesting. Yeah,
you might be right.
You know, that's an interesting point, and I think it relates to something that I thought was well done in the show, which was the moment when Arondir figures out, wait, some of these bodies here are not orcs, and they start uncovering the faces, and it's not entirely realistic, but I like the theme that's being introduced in that moment, which is that we humans have the potential for both good and evil within us, and these are our friends, they're our neighbors, they're our relatives, and there's something that just was a little bit more visceral and tragic in that. So I thought that was well done.
I agree. Well. I'd actually forgotten to mention that, but I agree that was a nice little turn there, and you could say that was a predictable moment as well. But again, it's a lot of it's in the execution, and I think it did work, and it thematically was important. So
there was one moment that I found the execution, as you say, not up to par for me, and it was the all hail King of the Southlands moment. You know, from Bronwyn talking to from Bronwyn and the Queen talking to Halbrand saying yes, and everybody cheering. Just felt awkward.
So
it was
when
like,
I saw that
off there,
when I saw that scene, I wanted that guy from Monty Python, Holy Grail, to come in and talk about the theocracy of the, you can't just hand out kingship from a blade or something.
Yeah.
That whole dialogue.
That's so I think, but for me, what it was, Glenn, because I had the same feeling, and that's the one scene that if I really had to pick a scene that just didn't quite work for me in this episode, that would be it. And it was because a lot of it is around Halbrand, and it made me sort of like look at him with side eye a little bit of like, okay, I know he was struggling. I know he came to some kind of acceptance at the end of the last episode. And there's the bit that he has with Galadriel where we understand like how much an impact fighting with her had on him. So they are doing all of that to set up that moment. But somehow in that actual scene, it's still, I didn't quite understand how Halbrand was feeling, or like I wasn't quite believing that he would just say that and everyone would react that way. And it seemed a bit abrupt.
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
I think the roughness in that scene all centers around Charlie Vickers. Even though I still think outside of that scene, and this is spoiler for an answer later, he's one of my favorite performances of the episode outside of that moment.
Yeah.
Everything else good, but that one moment
but
where
it might be
king,
the
he's like,
writing of that episode, the writing of that part that is just didn't quite have enough there or something. I'm not sure.
But he's still on my list of favorite actors for the episode. So
yeah.
So like on the topic like opposite of best scenes.
Yeah.
That sort of montage they tried to do with like crafting the weapons and stuff before this battle.
Okay.
It was like when I first saw that, I was kind of like, why would you spend time making swords? And then later I saw they made those into spears, so I was happy about that.
Okay.
yeah.
That I made them spears, because they made swords like waste of your time.
Don't do that.
It takes a lot longer than 2 hours.
Sure. Yeah.
And go ahead.
Is a really long spear really the right weapon to wield when you're standing inside of a tavern? You're inside of a tavern.
You stick it through the holes.
Tavern. Maybe a short spear. I don't know. It was just the length of the spear was like, that's going to be awkward to use in a crowded tavern.
Hey, you do what you got to do.
Yep.
The other part was when Bronwyn killed that orc that was trying to kill Isildur. No, not Isildur. Arendor. When he was, the eyeball thing going on.
Yeah.
And she took the blade and like stabbed it through the throat in the back, and she's just standing there with the blade kind of held backwards like this. I can just imagine her on her tippy toes kind of doing this.
Maybe she was, yeah.
And kind of like trying to get as high as she could to get that blade just perfect. Like I feel like she could have killed that orc 10 times before she got in that position to go through the like I just imagine her standing behind it, just kind of lining up, leaning back, and nope, got a position all while he's fighting and getting that thing almost in his eye.
Well, that was a big beast. You got to do it right. Anything worth doing is worth doing right?
Although it was one of the more predictable events, I think.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
That always happens, the hero's down being choked or whatever, or blade almost to their eye.
And
at the last moment. Yep.
Well, yeah.
Every show that does that kind of
thing. And she stopped just before hitting him with the blade.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Also, she did very well with that. All right. So
almost surgical precision, if you will.
She said, no, what do you expect? Commander of the Northern Armies. How many
centuries
has she been fighting?
Bronwyn.
Oh, Bronwyn. Oh, yeah.
Bronwyn is secretly Sauron. I mean,
beginner's luck, right?
Yeah.
She's actually been pretty good, pretty effective with her orc killing, I have to say.
That's true. Yeah, she had
go
that
for the throat
too with the head. Yeah.
Okay, so now we've been kind of skirting around this next question, so I think we get to it. Our standout actors for the episode. Dr. Chase, do you want to start?
Oh my goodness. I have to give it to, and I have actually a lot of respect for all the performances. I'll just say that. I mean, I've been a fan all along. I think the actors have delivered what they've been asked to do and more. So, but I'm going to give it to Adar for this one. I really enjoyed his performance, and I found myself convinced that he believes that what he's doing is the right thing.
Yeah.
He's not just some two-dimensional villain, mustache twirling, all that. He actually believes in what he's doing. He knows there's a sense of he has been wronged, and so have his children, the orcs, and that the world is a horrible, painful place where we pretend that there are good people and they're evil, and that he and his people have been classified as evil. And he sees through all this, and he has this other narrative that I'm not with him. I'm not about to be like Waldreg and go join enlist in Mordor or anything like that. But I find him persuasive, and that to me is good. That's a good performance where you can persuade me that. Before he just seemed like a little weird and kind of just evil for evil's sake, but now I'm thinking this is really good. So that was a standout performance for me.
Yeah,
you have a couple of runner-ups.
Agree.
Any runner-ups you wanted to share?
Ooh, runner-ups. I liked, like I said before, I liked Bronwyn's delivery of those lines to her son. That got me. That affected me pretty well, and I think she successfully channeled a mother's pain in that scene, which is very powerful. So I would have to say, I would definitely highlight her performance as well.
Okay, good picks. Yeah, Max, did you have any inanimate objects that you can shout out for us this week?
Nothing for objects this week. There wasn't much.
The hilt didn't do it for you?
You didn't think the mountain was like acting the crap out of becoming a volcano?
No.
Okay. All right.
Okay. I really blew that part.
You've already kind of covered Adar, Joseph Mawle. Interestingly, I was kind of looking him up earlier, and apparently he played Benjen Stark in Game of Thrones.
It is indeed Uncle Benjen.
Well, if anything, I thought it was interesting, the parallels between Benjen and Adar.
Yeah.
There's interesting parallels there. Apparently, he was also Odysseus in Troy: Fall of a City.
Okay.
I haven't seen that one.
And Jesus in the Passion TV series, I guess.
Okay.
Yep, I knew that. That was a few years ago.
I'd say I liked Theo's acting this episode.
It was a step up. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was given something to work with here besides being an annoying dumb shit
teenager. Yeah.
Yeah.
I usually go ahead. You done? Sorry.
Yeah, it's good for now.
I usually do 3. My favorite this episode was Nazanin Baniadi as Bronwyn.
I have a hard time pronouncing her name. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, Nazanin Baniadi. I had it earlier and just lost for a second. She was just, I think this is her best episode for me, at least so far.
Some tough work to do. Yeah.
She was just impressive. Joseph Mall as Adar, of course. You guys have talked about that. I mentioned Charlie Vickers. I've got him tied with Morvid Clark as Gladriel. I think Morvid was actually really good this episode, I think, as Gladriel. It might not have been her best as Gladriel, but I think she was pretty good. And other than that one moment with Charlie Vickers.
But no, she was good.
Yeah. It was definitely Nazanin Baniadi as Bronwyn for my number 1 this episode.
Yeah.
And I didn't really try to come up with a least favorite. There wasn't any bad performances that I noticed this episode.
No,
number 5 was awful, and he should be ashamed of himself.
Okay. I mean, I do get annoyed a little bit at like orc-like creatures making unnecessary growling and snarling noises all the time when they're like wandering around looking for people. Why? Just because you hear some animals that might do that doesn't mean an orc's going to do that. And I just think that that's silly. That little bit of sound mixing that people do with orc-like creatures, or like a vampire. Every vampire in a vampire movie is always hissing. Why? It was why? They're not a cat.
It's a thing. It's become a thing.
But,
so now you have to do it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just a trope.
Sorry. Oh, I was going to say a slightly more positive sound is every time Elendil opens his mouth, I think, man, I wish I had a voice like that guy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He does have a good voice.
Great voice. I mean, that's a commander's voice right there. That was great casting, I think.
Yes.
Him. Yeah. He's very convincing as an ancestor of Aragorn. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see it.
Definitely.
Yeah. I don't have too much to add. I mean, I think you guys, mentioned, I mean, all the performances were actually really very good. And I think you mentioned all the top ones. I'll say, there wasn't as much there's more action than scene work for Ismael Cruz Cordova this episode, but he did do an excellent job, and some of those action scenes were really great. So he's up there too. He's always been often a standout in a lot of the episodes for me. So
yeah, he's consistently great.
Yeah, he's good. Yeah.
I like the intensity that he brings to the role. I think he's, like Glenn said, he's one of the coolest elves I've ever seen.
Definitely.
So,
and I think that usually he I feel like he can emote as an actor when he doesn't have dialogue. So I feel like I understand a lot of what's going on.
His wonderful eyes. I love his eyes.
Yeah.
I think this show will make the actor a star. A big star. When the show's done, he's not going to have trouble finding roles. And if he wants to stay in action roles, he is definitely not going to have trouble finding action roles.
I could think of a certain elf he could play in another fantasy series.
Drizzt?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. You called him that earlier, didn't you? Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, I think he's good. I agree. He's definitely good. And what are we up to next?
So our last main topic here is themes in this episode. So themes that caught your attention and, how you think they might be relevant to the source material. Anyone want to jump in with something?
Well, one of the major Tolkien themes in the Silmarillion and in the Lord of the Rings is really the capacity of humans for good and evil, and the choices we make and the consequences of those choices. And I thought that was a very well done on the show's part to convey that, as I said earlier, in the battle scene where they realize some of the dead that they killed are actually their own people. And they have this legacy here in the Southlands as well, that they were in the past on the wrong side. And that's why the elves were there to watch them in the first place. And there's some resentment about that. And it's even contained in the character Halbrand, right? Who has this capacity for good, and he's dashing and he's cool and we like him, but he also seems to be just a little bit too clever sometimes. And he keeps alluding to this stuff that he did that he's ashamed of, that he was running away from. So it's something that Tolkien definitely emphasized, and I think they're doing it really well. That and pride is another big one that they're doing beautifully, and Galadriel's ongoing lessons and learning to be a little more human, if you can say it that way, for an elf. And that's something they're bringing out with the relationship with Halbrand, I think, really effectively. But pride being a major factor here. The Númenóreans, of course, it's all over the Silmarillion, the idea of pride and leading people astray into hubris, right? And into doing some things that they really ought not to do. And you can see that that's been developed pretty consistently throughout the season, I think.
Yeah. Good and evil is obviously going to be there in pretty much anything Middle-earth related or Tolkien related, because it's such a core concept of everything tied to Arda. But I had a couple of others, and I think the one that I found the most of was deception. The whole idea of deception, because you've got the orcs, as you brought up, Philip, the orcs using the humans in orc armor to fool the villagers. The humans pulled a deception on the orcs when they abandoned the tower. And then when they came to the village, they were deceiving the orcs by making it look like the village was empty. until they cross the bridge. I mean, it's just constantly, the production crew made it, deceived us. This is totally this is like not story related, but when I was grossed out the first 2 times watching it, so I conned it on the 3rd time. Isildur's in there with the horse, and he takes a couple bite of the apple, then lets the horse take the bite of the apple, and then starts taking a bite. And I was just like, swap and spit with a horse is just kind of gross. But then I noticed he's holding the apple. He's holding the apple in his hand. And then he drops it below the camera's sight for a second, and then comes back up before he takes a bite. So they could easily have switched the apple prop in his hand. Because I'm like, I don't know, man. You're having to pay me a lot to swap spit with a horse.
You just worked really hard to get in that moment, didn't you? You were like, let me fit this into a theme so I can somehow talk about this apple.
But
there was a theme of like horse and human love, because that is really explored there. Yeah. Anyway.
Let's see. Elendil made the comment that sailing in, as they were sailing into the sunrise, that for him it felt like night. It kind of almost makes it sound like the sun itself, in a way, is deceiving Elendil. I mean, it's just, ooh, Kitty. Hi,
not
Kitty.
Really listening to you anymore, Glenn, because there's a cat on screen.
Hi there, Kitty.
Oh, it's a kitty cat.
It's a nuisance.
I mean, the other 2 examples of it that I found, one, we talked about the swapping of the axe and for the sword hilt. And then Adar, we talked about trying to deceive Galadriel when he's telling him Sauron, after the defeat of Morgoth, tried to heal Middle Earth. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
I don't see him trying to heal Middle Earth.
But do you think that Adar is trying to deceive Galadriel, or do you think that Sauron deceived Adar and he believes that?
Yes.
Could be both.
Or it's a very liberal interpretation of the word heal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, right, because from his perspective, maybe if you're making the Middle Earth so that, orcs can live, maybe that's healing as far as he can.
Yeah. Orcs need their shade. So,
At this point in time. Also had some reluctant leadership. Bronwyn, and then obviously Hallbrand, up until the very last moment, was pretty reluctant. Love.
Good. Yeah.
Love is a big theme in this. A lot of pairs, and not necessarily romantic love, but just love in general. Bronwyn and Theo's love for each other. Bronwyn and Arondir's love for each other. Adar's love for his orcs. And I'm assuming they have love for him back.
Oh, yeah.
Both Isildur and Elendil have a love relationship with the horse Beric. That's pretty obvious. And then obviously Elendil and his son Isildur, their relationship, father-son love. So love was definitely a theme in this episode too.
Almost all of those are parent-child relationships.
Yeah.
Not Arondir and Bronwyn, of course, but otherwise you've mentioned, because Adar is a father to the orcs, essentially.
Yep.
So that's a parent-child relationship, and
it's still love.
Oh, I know. I'm just saying there's even more of a narrower theme there if you're looking at it that way, because a lot of it is parental and parent-child love.
Yeah, and there's Elendil and Isildur, and there's of course Theo and Bronwyn, and to some degree they've been giving us more of Theo and Arondir.
Right.
Yeah.
It related to love, or related to that emotion in a way, is bonds developed in battle. We've got, Elendil is explaining to Isildur about the bond of a Númenorian horse going into battle with its rider. So we've got Isildur and Beric developed a bond since they rode into battle together. And then Galadriel and Hallbrand, we talked about it earlier. There's some sort of bond that if they didn't have a bond before, they have one now.
Right, because they both felt that with fighting together, that has bonded them more strongly together in some way.
Yeah.
And I don't want to leave out loss. Theo talked a lot about loss with his feelings over the hill. That really made me think of, his feelings towards the hill really made me think of all the ring bearers' feelings towards the One Ring.
Yeah.
You know, it was a very similar,
very deliberate, like in the lines that Arondir had to him, they're making that connection. They're very clear in my mind about like, be rid of it, you know, like, or in the idea of giving it to the Numenorians to toss into the ocean, because that was certainly discussed about doing to the One Ring, you know, can you be rid of it that way? And there was also the scene where Arondir was trying to destroy it, and he's like, well, we don't have the means to do this. So they were drawing lots of parallels there between that key and the One Ring and Theo's relationship to it specifically.
It also comes up when Adar is talking about the loss of all of his children to Sauron's experimentations. You know, he was tired of, you know, he had lost a lot of work. And Isildur and Elendil both thinking about Isildur's deceased mother. That came up on the ship, you know, that it was brief little moment, line or two with one character and line or two with the other. But, you know, they both have that sense of loss that they were thinking about in this episode. And that's pretty much it, except for the whole idea of pulling back from the edge, which, you know, Halbrand and Galadriel did for both of each other.
Yeah. I don't have too much to add to what you've all said. I think that, you know, to me, I think that there's lots of, you know, little themes. I think the two probably biggest things that I think were hit on pretty clearly in this episode were, when it comes to the sort of good versus, you know, evil question, to get like a little bit more specific, I think for Galadriel, there's the question of like, when does good become indistinguishable from evil? You know, when does your method and your approach in fighting evil make you indistinguishable from evil itself? And I think that's an important question.
And we've been seeing that one since episode 1 with Galadriel.
Well, she brought it back in last episode as well, not so much directly, but indirectly, when she was saying to Halbrand that admitting that she thought that her friends couldn't distinguish her from the evil she was fighting. And then we see that like mirror held up to her directly with Adar basically saying that to her, you know, like, are you sure you're not Morgoth's successor? Maybe you should be looking at yourself.
She was ready to torture her. She was ready to torture her, a prisoner, a helpless prisoner, right?
Right.
I like that little bit of an Easter egg in the dialogue there, talking to Galadriel, saying, your mirror. It's just, I mean, there's a chapter. Isn't that the name of the chapter takes place in? Mirror of Galadriel. So it's like, talking to Galadriel, and you say, look in your mirror. I'm like, clever. That was clever bit of line use.
So I think that's a really important piece of the theme. You know, how do you really distinguish, and looking at it from the other side of like, well, how do you know that what Adar and his followers are doing is evil? You know, if you sort of, you know, look at like they're trying to find a place where they can live, you know, what exactly are they supposed to do? They exist and they have no place to live. They have no place to be. And this is what happens with humans too. Again, that parallel that that you brought up about you know, humans fighting each other and like the potential that we have for evil. Is it that different? Not saying it's good what they're doing again, but is it that different from what humans would do in that circumstance where they have no home and they have no place to be, and yet they exist and they want to keep existing, you know? So, it's very different. So,
there's an introduction of nuance, I think, here a little bit. Something that for some reason really stuck out to me was the fact that the humans took some orc prisoners. And you don't see that usually. They just, you know, you don't think about orcs as prisoners, because are orcs ever prisoners? They just slaughter them, and nobody thinks about it, right?
Always writes either that they're all dead, or the ones that aren't dead flee. It's always like that. They kill a certain number of them, and then the rest flee, and that's it.
And they keep killing the ones who are fleeing too.
And by having orcs being prisoners, I feel like that is asking for a little more sympathy for them, perhaps, or that they're worthy of being kept alive as prisoners.
The reverse has also happened too, where Arondir was a prisoner, and Adar didn't kill him, let him leave as a messenger, And we really only see that in the Lord of the Rings when they've captured Merry and Pippin under specific orders of, don't kill them because we might really need them for something, not because they're halflings and we shouldn't just slaughter them indiscriminately. Like, no, they wanted to, but they had specific orders. Otherwise, orcs don't take prisoners either.
There's a silver lining to taking these orcs prisoner right after a battle. You're not going to have a hard time feeding them. There's a lot of meat laying around. They're orcs. Meat's back on the table, boys.
So the theme that kind of stuck with me is the one I mentioned several episodes back about that little, when they think all hope is lost and it comes again. It's the old Gandalf scene, both of his, where he is the light that saves them all. Mm-hmm. And in this case, we have the Numenorians saving the day.
Yeah.
And it's what Bronwyn says too, right? Like about the line about the shadow being a passing thing.
Mm-hmm. Other than that, when you mentioned, I'm trying to think what the word was, about the shades of gray and evil and all that, kind of reminded me that, so the original Lord of the Rings was basically kind of an allegory to World War I, if I'm not mistaken.
Don't say that.
Oh yeah, Tolkien
did not like that.
Now.
Yeah. Like it's like the world building of, you know what I mean? Like they always keep mentioning World War I and World War II and Tolkien's experience in there, and the world being somewhat resembling that.
Well, like I said,
especially like post-war Hobbitville.
I think what he actually despised, I think the phrase he used was direct. And now what's allegory? Thank you. Man, I blanked for a second. Direct allegory. It's not just allegory. I think he specifically puts the word direct in that quote. But Daniel Green did a video on this a few years ago. If you continue on in the rest of that letter, he talks about how, it kind of is, despite me not liking it, despising it, in a lot of ways that, you can't help but have what affected me when I, this is him, this point of view, what affected him during World War I. He can't help but have that come out on the page, whether he's thinking it in, intentionally or not.
So
he might
that's
have
that's about Lord of the Rings
definition. Yeah.
And that's about Lord of the Rings, but this is Rings of Power. And putting in that kind of perspective, that made me think about, these writers in this, and you mentioned the Southlands, and we have brothers fighting brothers. That sounds very familiar from an American standpoint of writing.
Yeah.
We have the Civil War side, which would probably make Robert Jordan very happy that this could be not like a civil war, but a Southern story.
Yeah.
Of good versus evil,
like that,
shades of gray. You have brother fighting literal brother.
But you do have that split in the.
We literally have elf brother fighting elf brother.
True.
Because there was a bit of
when you think about these orcs are brothers of elves, and very distantly, but they are brothers.
Good point. Yeah.
So Civil War is a kind of a theme kind of here. The other thing that I think I mentioned this also as well is had to do with the shades of gray, and I mentioned before, like, because I've read the Dritz novels, and one of the things they've talked about in the recent ones is you have that society of like the Dark Elves that were just evil, and we learned throughout the time that effectively we have people that were through millennia of choices that they made over the years. They went from effectively good elves to evil through tiny choices over time, and I kind of get that from Adar. Of he made these tiny choices throughout time. He chose to, go with Morgoth. He chose not to.
It may not have been even a choice. He might have been abducted and tortured, and the scarring on him suggests that he was subjected to some kind of torture. So it might not even been voluntary. Yeah.
But there's also that thing about the Sindar and not going to see the two lights or trees, whatever it was. You had the dark elves in LTR Lord of the Rings that didn't see the trees. Correct. And that was their choice, their small choices throughout time, through the millennia.
True.
And I kind of get that in the sense of this, of these just tiny evils you do throughout time, and they accumulate. Where now what you thought was good is now, or what you thought was evil before is now good, and what you thought was good is evil. It twists you.
It's sort of like a version of Theseus's ship, in a way. That's the one where if you replace a part of the ship, over the course of 100 years, every part gets replaced at one point or another. Is it still the original ship? Which, happens with the human body about every 7 years. 7 years from now, I will no cell in my body now that I currently have will be in my body 7 years from now, because that's the cycle they go out. So that's always happening to us, literally. But there was one line that I forgot to bring up. I kind of did a little fist pump into the air when Galadriel leaned forward and said "Norolim, Norolim" to the horse, because I was like, yes, Norolim, run swift, made it into the, I just like, it's one of the few lines of Elven, of Sindarin, I think it's Sindarin, that I know. I don't know much of the way, in the way of Elven, but I know Norolim. And I was happy to.
I recognize that too, yeah.
Although wouldn't Galadriel be more likely to speak Quenya?
I think Quenya was used more like the way we use Latin. I've used Latin for the last 2,000 years. It's kind of like of a more formal, ritualistic language. At least I was, according to something I was reading recently about the languages of Middle-earth. Do we have anything else?
Yeah, this is the point where if there's anything else that, you didn't get to mention that you wanted to bring up, we can add it here.
I do have one quick, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I just want to say thank you for inviting me here. That's what I wanted to add.
Definitely.
This was a lot of fun chatting with you three. And
thank you.
I really enjoyed hearing your insights into this episode and to the show in general. It's a lot of fun.
I loved hearing your thoughts as well. It was really great.
Looking forward to doing a chat on, what are we going to do? Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf film? I know we're doing the Green Knight, right?
Yeah, I mean,
you
can't. I mean, if you asked me to talk about Beowulf, that's
you talk that one too. That's your favorite, isn't it?
But yeah, sure, yeah, it's definitely Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and you guys are going to talk about the movie The Green Knight as well, right?
The one with Dev Patel is the movie we're going to look at.
Yeah.
So
cool. Yeah.
So we would definitely. I do have a quick question about this episode. Can anybody think of a reason why a lowly stable sweep would be up on the hill, up on the ridge, on his horse, next to the queen? He's just a stable sweep. Why is he up there waiting with them, the officers who are watching the battle? I just thought that was kind of weird.
They obviously didn't show it, so this is an off-screen thing. They cut out a big chunk of their journey there. But Galadriel, when she spoke with Isildur, seemed very impressed with him.
Yeah.
So he managed to, surprisingly, I guess, really impress the commander. And so maybe she had something to do with it.
It was half a snarky question, but it did seem kind of silly.
Well, I gave you my
really seem strange
answer.
that he was right next to the queen, and his horse is sitting there wanting to go, and she's like, "Go," and I'm like, "Okay, oh well."
So if you want a random prediction here for you, since we've kind of got the recreation of Gandalf over the ridge with horses, I'm predicting if we get Durin's Bane, he might pull a Gandalf and save Elrond.
Oh, wow.
Good one. I like it.
I mean, I won't be surprised if this series, maybe not this season, if we see Durin's Bane, because we've already seen a Balrog at least once, if not twice. I can't remember if there's a Balrog in that big fight scene in the prologue with the eagle and the fell beast.
And if Amazon didn't plan that, they can pay me if they like that idea.
Okay.
You get the check in the mail, I'm sure.
It does seem inevitable. Question is maybe when we get a Durin and Durin's Bane.
Oh, I'm there for that scene. I'm definitely there. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, we didn't get to talk about Elrond and Durin in this episode because they weren't in it.
Or the Harfoots.
Yeah. That was one thing I will say in general about this episode, that why I think it was like a slightly step down in my enjoyment. And I understand why they did it, and I don't disagree with the decision, but I missed those plot lines.
Same here.
I missed the Hobbits. I definitely missed the Hobbits.
Yeah. We need a full episode of Hobbits.
But then we also need a full episode of Elrond and Durin.
Yeah.
Elrond Durin.
Possibly.
Yeah. Elrond Durin. Absolutely.
Yes.
We need an episode of Harfoots and
That's
Durin.
their ship name.
We'll take that. We'll take that. Yeah.
I want to see the Hobbits with Durin.
Okay.
Just bantering back and forth.
I mean, bring it. I
with some ale, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Halflings might be able to outdrink a dwarf. I'm not sure. They're pretty good drinkers too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, thank you for being here. Philip, thank you for joining us. It's been an honor to have you on. Been looking forward to this for a while, and we'll have you on again. Max, Rebecca, thanks for joining me again as always. And to the audience, thank you for watching. Please leave a like, a subscribe, and leave some comments. I want comments. Yell at me in the comments section, please. Tell me what a jerk I'm being, or tell me how wrong I am. Whatever. So thank you for being here, everybody, and come back next week, and don't forget to be awesome.